Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest with me this morning is Cap Stewart. Cap is a writer and also a researcher, particularly on the very, well, can I say, spicy topic of the pornification of entertainment. Cap, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, Cap, this podcast is called Profiles in Christian Living. I've got to start by asking you, how did you yourself become a Christian?
Sure. I I don't know if I'll ever this side of heaven be able to know for sure exactly when the moment was, because I grew up thinking myself as a Christian, having made a profession of faith when I was very young. But my relationship with God, it was one of, it was duty bound. It was not, there wasn't a lot of delight in it. I was trying to prove myself, trying to earn my way. It was very, works oriented, very legalistic. And so I believe, if I had to put my finger on it, I believe it was actually when I turned 20, I was at a Christian conference, wasn't looking to get saved because I thought I already was, but just heard a message about Christ being our treasure, and something about that message and the music afterwards, just it penetrated my soul in a way that never had happened before. And I believe just the Holy Spirit came on me in power, in grace, in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I was different since then. And just my relationship with God became just something that was it was a delight. It wasn't a duty to serve Him. I enjoyed Him, and enjoyed fellowshipping with Him, and having His power work in my heart to grow and to change. And so I believe that's when I was genuinely converted. I wasn't looking for it to happen. Just shows God's kindness to me, and His sovereignty in working that out. But yeah, that's I believe when I was converted.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask you a question I ask all young converts, right?
Okay.
Particularly when they become members of my church. If there's one verse in the Bible, and it could be as simple as John 3:16, okay? So
Okay.
in that sense, there's no right or wrong answer. But if there's one verse
Right.
in the Bible which for you encapsulates the hope of the gospel, what would you say for Cap Stewart?
Wow. If there That's a great question, and there could be so many answers. A verse that encapsulates just the hope of the gospel.
Yeah.
Oh man. Oh man. You know, so I might answer this a little differently than a lot of people would. Instead of a verse, I'm going to go to my favorite book of the Bible, which is First Corinthians. And I've studied that a lot because it actually applies to a lot of the stuff I've been researching and writing about, but just Paul's interaction with the Corinthians. Um, or like a really messed up church, like it's easy to point out how many areas they were messed up in. And he starts out by talking about how joyful he is to know them, and how he's thankful for them and their gifts. And just throughout that entire book, you see him interacting with these people who don't deserve they don't deserve a lick of respect, and yet he is giving them grace and offering them mercy, because that's what the gospel is. It isn't about something that's earned or deserved. And so that just really has spoken to me a lot. Just that just the unearned nature of grace, and how it's not something that we could have procured for ourselves. We can never be good enough. All our righteousness is like filthy rags, and yet God's grace is sufficient for us. So off the top of my head, anyway, I could probably come up with a better one, but that's what I'm sticking with for now.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's a great explanation, because you do talk so much about the pornification of entertainment, and in particular, I think the standard that God has for us for moral and sexual purity. How did you get interested in researching this particular topic?
Sure. I've always been interested in movies since being a young child. There was something that we did as a family, was watch movies as I grew up, and so I've always been interested in the visual arts. I went to school for video production technology and filmmaking, and so it's been in my blood, pretty much since the beginning. So there's already a built-in interest there for me. I love movies and television shows, but I would say what really got me going just in this particular avenue was back in, I believe it was 2013. I picked up a book called Worldly Amusements: Restoring the Lordship of Christ to Our Entertainment Habits. And it's by Pastor Wayne Wilson, and just a great book on the Christian's posture toward movies in particular. And he had one chapter in there called The Law of Love, where he talked about some things that I had never even heard of before. And he pointed out that, when you're talking about, sexuality in film and in our media, one thing that we forget to consider is those on the other side of the camera. Like we always talk about, is this appropriate for me? Is this going to bother me? Is this going to be a stumbling block to me? Which are all legitimate questions. But he pointed out that like actors aren't thrilled with performing in scenes of hypersexuality either. And like they're not even, these aren't people with a strong Christian sexual ethic, and yet they still, in actor interviews and so on and so forth, they often share their discomfort, even mortification with having to film that kind of content. And so he just opened my eyes to realize I'd been so inward focused on, like, is this appropriate for me? I haven't even been thinking about loving my neighbor as myself, and these actors that I'm paying to entertain me are my neighbors. And so that just it radically shifted my my perspective on the visual arts and how Christians should engage with it, especially from the standpoint of evaluating sexual material. And it changed my my writing output. So much of what I write now has to do with that topic in particular. And as I grew in this area in seeking to love others more and not just to worry about myself, that helped me grow in genuine love. And it affected our marriage. Our marriage and our romance has grown exponentially since then. And so it's just something that I want to get the word out to more and more Christians, because this is one small sliver of the pie that should be the discussion about movies. Like, this isn't the only issue, but it's an issue that so many people aren't talking about or even aware of. And so I just want to boost the signal as much as I can, get other Christians to think about issues that they may not even be front and center for them, that I think should be important.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And you wrote a really excellent article, I think, in the Gospel Coalition. I'm just going to pull up the title here so that people can find it. Immature Defenses of Mature Sexual Content in Movies. And I've been wrestling with this because I think you use the example, or at least the thumbnail is, of the Oppenheimer movie that's out.
Right.
I love Christopher Nolan. I think he's a brilliant director. Any movie he does is worth watching. This movie, though, I haven't been able to bring myself to see it because actually my children had alerted me to like a 4 or 5 minute sex scene with nudity in the movie. Step us through the logic, or I guess the argument of your article, Cap, and how we think about whether or not this is justifiable.
Right. Well, with that article, what I did, because I've been writing about this since around 2013. So now we're getting, it's been about a decade that I've been writing about this. So I've interacted with a lot of folks and heard a lot of arguments and excuses for, well, here's why it's okay to watch that, or so on and so forth. And so I picked the 5 of the most commonly used arguments in the article, and I just briefly went through each one just to show, hey, these are faulty arguments here. Now, some of them have more traction than others because, like, there's a grain of truth here, a grain of truth there, but we need to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. And so that's what I was kind of the goal of that piece, was to kind of coalesce a lot of what I've been learning over the last decade or so, and kind of just to pinpoint, here's some of the key arguments that I see, and here's why they don't stand up when we're talking about pornified media and pornified entertainment.
So, okay, let me take an example which I think a lot of people bring up, and that is, well, I can just skip that little section. I can fast forward. Pretty
Sure.
hard to do when you're in movies, but I close my eyes or something like that. How do you respond to that kind of argument, for instance?
Sure. And like, that is technically true. And especially when you get to streaming stuff, you have VidAngel and other very highly customizable content filtering services, to where, like, you could rent something, say, I don't want to see that 1 or those 3 or whatever sex scenes, and then, no more problem. You just skip right over that kind of stuff. So yes, that is technically true. And what I like to point out is that, it's good to be concerned about how you are going to be affected, like I mentioned earlier. Like, there are 2 great commandments that Christ gave us: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think the Christian community, especially within my circles, I think has done a really good job about trying to honor that. We want to make sure we don't put things before our eyes that are a stumbling block. Again, great considerations, but there's a second commandment, and that's love your neighbor as yourself. So yeah, you could skip the scene, but there's no skipping the scene for the actor who had to film that for hours or days, depending on the logistics of the scene. And if you're streaming it or going to a movie or paying for it, then you are being a party to perpetuating that thing. When you pay for a movie ticket or decide I'm gonna stream this movie for the weekend or whatever, the message Hollywood gets is more like this, please. I mean, that's what you're saying, and you might say, well, no, I use VidAngel. Well, yeah, you did, but the person across the street rented the same movie because he wanted to see the sex scenes, and Hollywood's looking at that. They don't know any different. They know that two people stream the movie, and what that says to them is, oh, well, those two people want more of what we're going to do, so we're going to keep doing that. So that's what I try to gear the conversation toward, is to stop and think for a moment outside of just yourself. Yeah, you can, from a personal purity standpoint, skip the scene, okay, but like, what other components are in play here, and how can we better honor the second greatest commandment and how we make those entertainment choices?
Yeah, look, it's a really good point, because, and you raised this, and you sort of touched on this earlier about loving your neighbor and loving the actor that's actually putting themselves in place to perform. And look, let's be honest. Like you've said in one article before, the history of film is about boys photographing girls. They tend to be more the objects here. Um, and
Right,
there is something different, isn't there, about violence, which is pretend, but
right,
that intimacy or sex scenes which the actors are aroused, and there's this tension that on the one hand, if a male actor is aroused, it's awkward. If they're not aroused, it's like, oh, have I not performed up to a certain level? Um, can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by loving our neighbor in relation to the actor that's forced to perform these scenes?
sure. Well, you also make a good point. Just that there is a difference between on-screen violence and on-screen sexuality, and that's not to say that on-screen violence isn't an issue. I think there's a lot of gratuitous violence out there that certainly we need to be concerned about, and we need to be wise in what we're choosing to patronize as well. But I'm just focusing on this one area, and so yeah, people can bring that up. Well, what about extreme violence? Like, yeah, legitimate concern, but like you said, most violence on screen is acted out. It's not real. A lot of, unless a mistake happens, an actor isn't going to actually punch another actor. It's just framed in such a way to where it looks like they're hit. If they fall down, they fall on a mat. You have stunt doubles for some more rigorous stuff as well. So there's a lot of protection where the violence is legitimately simulated. It's not real. Now with sex scenes, they call it simulated sex because they don't actually do the do. But I mean, like, okay, well, that's a very reductionistic view of sex. Like, sex is a spectrum as God designed it, and it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And it's not just the matter of intercourse at the very end. It's this broad spectrum, and a lot of actors are engaging in what's what scientists would call like the sexual response cycle. And so you can't just reduce sex to this one thing. There's a spectrum here, and so they're simulating, but a lot of it is real. Like, they're actually kissing each other, they're actually undressing each other, they may be fondling each other, and so on and so forth. Stuff that you wouldn't do except with your covenant partner. And as I've read more and more reviews, like I said, a lot of actors share great discomfort with filming sex scenes. And like you said, some actors can get aroused, some actors are just mortified and horrified, and sometimes one might be mortified and the other is aroused. It just depends. But those are all responses that show, hey, something is going on here that's more than just acting. These folks are being asked, and the asking often includes a lot of societal pressure, like the story needs this scene, or whatever the case may be, and they're doing things that they're uncomfortable with, And like, again, they don't have a strong Christian sexual ethic, but they're saying, "Whoo, we don't like doing those. We wish we wouldn't have to do that part. That's the worst part of the industry. Don't like. Wish we could just do away with that." And yet, Christian patrons who are supposed to have a higher sexual ethic are saying, "Well, it doesn't bother me. I mean, it's fine for me to watch that, or I can just skip it, or whatever the case may be." And so I think I think with a lot of folks, with Christian patrons, I don't think it's intentionally selfish, but when we only consider ourselves, and that's all that we consider, you can foster a self-centered mindset without even realizing it. And then you discount others' experiences and other people being, sexually violated because, well, I'm okay, it doesn't bother me. And that's not a Christian attitude. That's not the kind of heart that God would have us have for other people made in his image. And so hopefully that addresses a little bit more about what I mean by, love your neighbor, and in this case, love your entertainer as yourself.
Yeah, another thing, and can I just say to those that are listening or watching, you write a lot of excellent articles, which are, many of them are freely available on Substack. So you just have to Google Cap
Right.
Stewart, Substack, a lot of great articles there, great things to follow up on. One of the key things you talk about, and I really appreciated this from an academic, scholarly point of view, was the pornification of entertainment today. Can you explain what you
Right.
mean by that?
Sure. And, with a lot of Christian circles, I don't think that's a surprise or even a controversial statement to make. I think a lot of people recognize, yeah, we live in a pornified society. Western culture is hypersexualized, and not even Christians, not even just Christians are making this point. I mean, I've read and looked at books like over the decades from secular scholars talking about how there's a porn infiltration of our media. And so practically any type of media, movies, television, video games, music videos, even just our advertisements. A lot of them are hypersexualized. And in fact, there's one book, it's a scholarly work that came out in 2021, not by a Christian at all, and even the author doesn't have a whole lot of problems with porn, but he describes what he calls the porn aesthetic in contemporary film and television. I think that's a helpful term, just because the porn aesthetic has infiltrated, not just seedy movies or like sexy thrillers or whatnot. We're talking about Oscar contenders. We're talking about like high quality films that otherwise are great stories, and yet there's an insertion of one or two sex scenes that borrow a lot of aesthetical qualities from the porn industry. And so that's something that I'm also trying to help people recognize, because it's one thing to recognize it, but if we are in a hypersexualized culture, which I believe we are, if you're swimming around in the water all the time, eventually you're not even going to feel wet because you're just used to it. And I think because even for Christians who are fighting for a heart of purity, you're inundated with so much stuff to a degree you can't help but become desensitized to it, to where you don't even recognize it when it's popping up in certain places because, oh, well, that's normal. People do that all the time, or whatever the case may be. And so we need to be careful about saying, well, that's no big deal, or saying, well, that's not pornography. It's like, well, I mean, no, like you mentioned Oppenheimer. Like I haven't seen the movie yet myself. I love Christopher Nolan too. Not quite sure if I'm ever gonna see the movie, but like just a couple sex scenes that are evidently fairly long, which include nudity and movement and so on. And like there's a porn aesthetic there. No, the film isn't a triple X feature. It's not an adult film you have to go to adult bookstore to find, but it's an artfully made film that has a few scenes that most people who have seen it seem to agree are gratuitous, like they're not necessary, and they have what you can call a porn aesthetic. And so that's what I am trying to address there and help people recognize. Let's stop pretending and saying, oh, well, it's not porn. I mean, sure, it's not hardcore pornography, but that's not all that is pornography. You have softcore porn as well, and that's more of what we're seeing in films and television.
Yeah, and look, there's a couple of things I guess I want to say is, on the one hand, a personal response. I know my own heart. Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can understand it? And I know how easily my heart wants to justify lust, and go and
Sure.
see Oppenheimer and sort of secretly cherish those scenes and replay them in my mind. I just know there's that sinful predilection, in me. But Cap, and I guess I'm also conscious that our consciences can be seared as Christians
Mhm.
and can be dulled. But, I guess an immediate response of a lot of people listening is, well, are you saying that then I can't watch any film that has blasphemy or swearing or violence or sex? How do you respond to that? Because if we did that, I guess we just wouldn't watch anything at all.
Right, right. And I certainly wouldn't say that, no, because I think the visual medium, film and television and so on, I think they're a gift from God. And just because these gifts have the potential to be abused doesn't mean that we should never go see them. We just need to be discerning and careful. Um, and I also want to be really careful when it comes to actual practices. I don't want to get extra biblical because it would be really easy to say, well, here's what I do. Now everybody else should do that. And maybe what I do is scripturally informed, and I believe it is, and I hope it is, but I wouldn't also say, well, that means everyone else should do it. There's a difference between scriptural imperatives and scripturally informed practices. So yeah, I want to be careful there. But what I would say is, I really want to challenge folks to just recognize their role in the process, and to, like, we can't claim innocence here. We can't say, well, the actor shouldn't have said yes to that scene if they didn't really want to film that. Well, you could turn around and say, well, yeah, you shouldn't have purchased a ticket if but you did. I mean, like, if you're involved in the process, you can't claim innocence. And so we just need to start thinking through, so what does a Christian sexual ethic look like when it comes to being a patron of the visual arts? And excuse me. So I do have some broad principles that if you want to, we can talk about. But I try to be careful and not give out, like, here's a list of rules you should do, because that's legalistic, and that's not biblical.
Yeah, and I appreciated that about your article. You I think very helpfully and correctly avoided legalism. But then there is the biblical command to be holy as the Lord your God is holy. So can I ask personally, what sort of guiding principles you put in place in your life to help you in this area?
Sure. And I would probably narrow it down to kind of three broad exhortations that I would have for folks with practices, or at least principles, because the practices might look a little bit different for folks, but kind of three principles that I think are exhortations that I would challenge people to think about. And the first, which we've addressed already, is look more outward than you do inward. Consider your role not as a consumer but as a neighbor, and, like, how can you more effectively love your entertainer as yourself? With the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus' definition of the neighbor is very broad. So it encapsulates just about anybody. You don't have to know the person. Like, the interaction with them can be very minimal. They may not even be aware of who you are. That doesn't matter. If there's some type of interaction, they're your neighbor. It could be the clerk you're buying groceries from, the driver you're behind on the road, and the entertainer you're paying to entertain you. So look more outward, and just let that be a factor, at least, in helping you decide, should I do this, should I not? Because just considering, is this good for me, isn't enough. It's good, but it's not enough. The second one I would say is to avoid overreacting by being legalistic. I think it would be wrong to say, you should never subscribe to a streaming service. That's inherently sinful. I think you can subscribe to a streaming service and be wise and discerning in what you choose to patronize. And it would be equally sinful to say you can never use VidAngel. Like, there are other reasons to use VidAngel than just for sex scenes. And so we just need to be careful, like, and create some absolutes that aren't there. And so I think there needs to be grace to let folks kind of, develop their consciences according to God's word in their particular sphere, and let them, let them, deal with God on without us having to tell them, every single step that they need to take. Then the third thing would be, well, I don't want to give a whole lot of specifics. Here's what you could do. Here's what you should do, or rather, here's what you should do. So, like, here's what you could do. as we move away from generalities and get more specifics, like what movie should I watch, what TV show should I watch, and now we're getting into more realms of right and wrong, and like not just a broad streaming service that offers a lot of opportunities, but Oppenheimer. Okay, like what should I do with that movie? It has a couple of gratuitous sex scenes where people who are made in the image of God sexualize themselves for the camera in a watching world. What should I do about that? So I would say that there are two practices that you could consider. One is to deny your desires, and the other is to delay your desires. So denying your desires might be you deciding, you know what, I wanted to see that movie, but I'm not going to because I don't want to be a party to that. I don't want to financially support that with the money that God has given me. Uh, Me loving my neighbor is much more important than me actually watching that film. So I'm just not going to do it. That could be a possibility. The other option is, delay your desires. And so this is often what I'll do. There's a movie that comes out, I really want to see it. Oh, there's one scene in there. Well, okay. So I'm not going to go to the theater to see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until it comes out on DVD, and then I'm going to find a used DVD somewhere. I'm going to purchase that DVD so that Hollywood gets no message from me saying, "Oh yes, I want more of this," and then I'll skip through that scene because I know exactly where it is, and then I'll watch it, 4 months later or whatever. And then, those are just a couple examples: denying your desires or delaying your desires, but letting your love of your neighbor be much more important than just, oh, this is a messy movie, I have to see it in theaters. Like, well, no, you don't. There's no Christian imperative to see every popular movie or to see any movie. And I love movies, but I mean, like, there is no such thing as like must see TV or messy film. That's not a Christian requirement. So just I would challenge folks to wrestle with, like, how should this reality affect my purchasing and streaming and viewing habits, because I think it should at some level affect how we engage with our visual entertainment.
Yeah, is there a higher principle here too, Cap, that entertainment can be a form of idolatry? And what I mean by that
Sure.
is that we go to entertainment for comfort, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, rather than to the Lord, rather than to His Word and to prayer and to Christian fellowship. Um, how much do you see that more broadly? Like with gaming, for instance, is the same kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Gaming,
Mm-hmm.
streaming, uh, and like with the explosion of social media, how much
Yeah.
have you? What do you think about that aspect of this whole question, and how do we respond as Christians to that?
So the idolatry question
Yeah,
in particular. Yeah.
yeah,
Yes, and I have written about it from a slightly different angle, just addressing probably the one big argument that I hear a lot that I actually didn't address in that Gospel Coalition piece that would have made it six and probably just would have been too much. But a huge argument people use is, well, the story required that. That's an excuse used by audience members to say, well, that's a part of the story. That's who the character was. It was required to tell that story authentically or honestly or whatever. From the filmmaker standpoint or the actor standpoint, they'll say, well, hey, I'm only okay with doing scenes as long as it's imperative to the story, or so on and so forth. But what that argument, I think, reveals actually is idolatry, because what you're saying is the story, if the story says this, then I'm gonna obey it. Like if the story says jump, I'm gonna say how high. Like, who made the story? God, right? Like God is
yeah.
God and not the story. And so if you're saying the story required this, I would say, at least a couple of things. One, are you idolizing story too much? Because there are some stories that can only be told pornographically, and we don't need to see those stories. So, like, the Christian's imperative is the gospel story. That's the only story that has jurisdiction over us. Like, the only story that has a jurisdiction over you is the one you're in. And we're in the gospel story where, we have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your bodies. Like, that's our story that we live in. And so if there's a conflict between what this story says and what the gospel story says, well, then if you say, well, this story over here requires that sex scene, then are you idolizing story too much? Are you idolizing movies too much? And there was a second point that has completely slipped my mind at the moment.
That's okay, because I think that's a really great point. And I wonder if another aspect of this is it actually is disingenuous, because some of the most powerful stories of sexual temptation that I can think of, for instance, from the Bible, Joseph with Potiphar's wife, or David when he sins
Mm,
with Bathsheba, there's nothing gratuitous, there's nothing graphic, but it's powerful. Is there a sense in which, like, I think you make a great point. I totally agree that we're idolizing the story, but are we actually taking away from the story by actually revealing too much, rather than
Yeah.
hiding some things which just shouldn't be exposed?
Sure, and I think you're right about that. And in fact, as I've been doing research for some larger writing projects, it's interesting reading about the golden age of cinema, where like it's generally agreed that this particular period of film called the Golden Age made the best films in the entire history of film. And like secular, Christian, whatever, most folks agree that that's the case. Now, there's disagreement on when the beginning and when the ending of that period was. But what's interesting is that in the Golden Age period, that's actually where there were the most strict guidelines for what could and could not be shown. And they were definitely too strict. It wasn't. I would never say let's go back to what's called the Hays Code, where they had very stringent policies and requirements. I think it was too strict. But even though it was too strict, what a lot of folks and film commentators, and as I'm doing research about, like, say, Casablanca, which is my favorite film, the movie was going to be more sexually explicit, but it couldn't be because the Hays Code was saying, no, you can't do that. You need to change this scene. You need to change that line of dialogue. And what a lot of people are saying is this film is actually stronger because it implied stuff instead of showing it. Once you start getting really explicit, and then you have actors get engaged sexually where they're maybe stimulated or whatnot, then that ruins the art, because now you're not engaging them artistically, you're engaging them sexually. And so I think there can be a strong argument made that by implication you can make a much stronger story than by explicit demonstration. And the golden age of Hollywood is definitely a good example of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As you were talking, I thought of this example of, I've got 6 children, so we've gone through every children's Bible and storybook you could imagine. And one of the best was the storybook Bible, where you never saw Jesus' face. You always saw
Mm,
over his shoulder or him from a distance. And I think it was deliberate to give a sense of his divinity, as well as his
yeah.
humanity. And so it actually gave you a sense of mystery of who is Jesus and his power, by actually revealing less than more. Um, and I
Mm.
love your point about the golden age of Hollywood, because I just showed my kids the other day the original 12 Angry Men with Henry Fonda,
Uh,
1957.
that is a phenomenal film.
I know, right? I mean, black and white. It's set in
Yep.
one room, and
Yep.
I couldn't believe it. My, 20-something-year-old kids were all sitting there riveted, going, "Dad, this
Yeah.
is the best movie I've ever seen." Um, What's the do you think there's an artistic challenge there, Cap, to get back to redeeming film and to actually creating good film, that Christians need to get back into that space? And if so, how?
Yeah, I definitely do think there's huge room for improvement. And I've been very critical of the faith based film industry, just because I'm passionate about movies, and a lot of the Christian faith based films have been very subpar. So there's a lot of room for growth. Now, I think we are seeing that growth, and I think we're getting some more artistic portrayals of stories, less cheesy, more nuanced, and that's good. And yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for Christian filmmakers to get in there and make not just explicitly Christian films. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with a movie that deals explicitly with faith or even conversion. Like, that's fine if it's handled well. But like a film like Casablanca, like that's it encourages strong morals and encourages living for something greater than yourself, and that's a great thing to promote. It doesn't have to be an explicitly Christian movie to really challenge and inspire people. And so I think there's just plenty of room for Christian filmmakers and Christian artists to get in there and to offer some alternative entertainment that is artistic, that is of high caliber in its production values, but also just telling genuine, regular stories and not just the conversion stories or whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, there seems to be a genre, doesn't it, of Christian film. And to be
Right.
honest, if you love films, you look at the Christian film with cringe, because you're sort of wanting it. You're sort of wanting to champion the cause. Why does it create that cringe in us? Like from a artistic, scholarly viewpoint, what's going on there that it's not resonating with the viewer?
I think because we are people of the word, and that's a good thing, and like words matter, they're very important. What we've done is we have taken the realm of visual media, and we're trying to apply a homiletics aesthetic to film, when those are two separate things. Like sermons are great. Faithful exposition of scripture we desperately need to make sure that we understand God's truth and his reality. But when we take those same rules for doing a sermon and then apply it to a film, well, like that's different. A story isn't a sermon, and it shouldn't be. A story might include sermons, it might include a clip of a sermon, like the movie Luther, about Martin Luther, that came out several years ago. There were scenes of him preaching that was generic to the plot. It was a part of the story. It wasn't gratuitous. It wasn't shoved in there. That was just a part of the story, and that's fine. But because so many, and historically, and like I said, we're moving away from that. But historically, Christian filmmakers have approached film with saying, I need to be explicitly clear with my message. It needs to be on the nose. All the dialogue needs to make sure that all the messages are clearly spilled out from characters' mouths instead of being communicated visually, because we've imbibed so many other stories from so many other angles. We're, even if it's not on a conscious level, we know what film is supposed to be, and then we come across a Christian film that treats film like a sermon, and suddenly it's like, something's wrong here. This isn't what a movie is supposed to be. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're treating films like sermons and vice versa, and those are two separate mediums.
Yeah, I saw a film. I don't know if you've seen this recently, Nefarious. And
Yes,
it's
I did.
almost like a modern day version of the Screw Tape Letters. And I thought it did a really good job, although at the end, it's got a little bit cheesy. Do you?
Yeah.
What was your assessment of that film? Do you think it hit the money that way?
I I am very critical of the filmmakers who made that film. One of their earlier films, God's Not Dead. I wrote a very critical piece called the God's Not Dead and the Bastardization of Christian Filmmaking, because I think it's a horrible film. Um, but when I saw the advertisements for that as like a Christian horror film by the filmmakers of God's Not Dead, I'm intrigued. I'm
And
going to see this. So
I've
so
got to ask
I
you, why
yeah.
did you think God's Not Dead was so bad?
For a lot of the reasons that we talked about, in the piece that I write, I go through three examples of why that film in particular is bad, and one of them is just that the caricature of all the atheists in the films. Like, we complain about how movies caricature Christians all the time and how they treat us unfairly, and that's true, and like that's not right. And we shouldn't turn the tables around and do the same thing to atheists and unbelievers and make them just horrible or stupid or whatever else. Like, there is nuance. Human beings are nuanced creatures, and if they don't believe in God, well, sure, that's wrong. But like, it's just it gives a picture of unbelievers that's very unflattering and very antagonistic, and that's just unnecessary. So that's just one reason why I think God's Not Dead is not a well made film. But as far as Nefarious, I I had less problem with, because it is fairly on the nose, but because it's more like a stage play where you have two main characters and they're debating and arguing, and so that is the story. So I had less problem with a lot of the dialogue dealing specifically with spiritual issues, and like you, overall, I thought, you know what, for a movie mostly about two men sitting at a table arguing, the way that it was shot, the way that that the conversation ebbed and flowed. There was a sense of cause and effect and a progression. It wasn't just, now let's talk about this, now let's talk about this. Overall, I was impressed and thought, okay, for what type of story they wanted to tell, I'm more impressed than less impressed. I think it's a sign of filmmakers that are actually, they're growing and they're getting better. And like you, I think the ending was cheesy. I think it could have been handled better. But I know a lot of other Christians still had problems with Nefarious because of just how blatantly Christian it was. But again, because of the nature of the story itself, it's like, well, it's two characters talking and arguing about philosophy, and there are other movies that do that. That's fine for what it is. So I was I was pleasantly surprised by Nefarious, even though I would have critiques of certain things. Overall, I was like, well, that was better than I expected.
I mean, another positive example that comes to mind, and I know we're riffing right now, is Jesus Revolution. I
Okay.
found myself riveted by that and moved to tears at numerous points in time. Do you see that as a good example of filmmaking? And I don't know if we'd call it Christian filmmaking, but it's
Right.
definitely got a Christian theme throughout.
Yeah, I have not seen Jesus Revolution. Honestly, it just never interested me. I know a lot of people who have seen it and who enjoyed it. So I can't comment on the work as a whole, whether I think it's good or not. I don't really know. It's just one that didn't interest me. But I because and like you said, a Christian film that's becoming harder to label, which I think is a good thing because Christians are making films that aren't necessarily explicitly Christian. I mean, Jesus Revolution is more so. Sound of Freedom would be another example of, some people would say, well, it's not a faith-based film because there's almost no reference to Christianity at all, but it was made primarily by Christians. Now it involved some Mormons as well, and so other people had a problem with that. But I think Sound of Freedom would be a good example of a Christian or a Christian-made film that doesn't need to wear its message on its sleeve. It tells an engaging story, and it doesn't need to sermonize. And I think that's a sign of Christian filmmakers going in the right direction.
Um, Cap, if I can just sort of round this out and come back to the original topic of the pornification of
Sure.
entertainment, it seems to
Yeah.
me, since we were particularly young boys, the biggest explosion has been with social media, and in particular TikTok, Instagram, but also Facebook and Facebook Reels and YouTube Reels, which is the short videos. Um, have you done much research into what's going on in that space? Because something that I've been interested in is, the dopamine hit, the chemical or hormonal release to the brain that is like, we call it in Australia. I'm sure you got something similar, doom scrolling, where you just go through the feed and
Yeah. Yeah.
you can just see yourself, in your mind's eye going sort of numb, but it's almost like really relaxing, but you can spend an hour and it just flies by.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
have you done much research into that phenomenon?
Honestly, no, no, I have not. I know that an acquaintance of mine, Samuel D. James, has just published a book called Digital Liturgies, and he addresses, from a Christian perspective, there we need to, that. We need to realize that the internet is not just a neutral tool. It is, by the way, it is baked and made and fabricated. There are inherent ideologies behind the way that it functions and works that are anti-Christian, and we need to be aware of those things while we're using, social media in particular. So I'm about to be digging into that book soon, but overall, no, I haven't really researched or addressed that particular phenomenon myself.
Okay. And look, just finally, you've got a really great curriculum called, I think it's the Purity Curriculum. Is that what it's called?
It's called Personal Purity Isn't Enough: The Long Lost or the Long Forgotten Secret to Making Wise or Biblical Entertainment Choices, something along those lines. Yes.
That sounds very Jonathan Edwards-esque.
Right.
um,
Yes, it is.
but it's got, I haven't been able to access it myself yet, but
Right.
I've seen great reviews about it. Can you give us a quick spiel about why this might be helpful for churches or individuals or small groups?
The course is currently actually shut down. I had it open for a while, about a year, maybe more. So it is currently shut down. So people actually can't sign up for the course. A lot of the material that a lot of that material I am working on to try to reformat it for book form. And so, Lord willing, depending on how that pans out, that could get published sometime in the future. Whether it's through a traditional publisher or self-publishing, I don't quite know yet. But I, this is an issue because so few people are talking about it. I mean, I'm just never running out of of opportunities for addressing it from this angle, or talking about this movie, or addressing it using this specific verbiage or this idea. So I am repeating myself in many respects, and a lot of the stuff in the course I'm talking about elsewhere as well. Probably the biggest thing in the course that I might want to tease out in some of my more publicly available things is the four forms of violation that typically take place during the filming of hypersexualized scenes. And so I delve into in more detail with, like, it's a privacy violation, it's a sexual violation, it's a dignity violation, and in many respects it's an agency violation because actors don't want to or don't like doing that. So those are four violations that often take place, and at least one or more are in play in just about any filming of any sex scene. And but yeah, so the course itself is not available publicly as of right now.
Yeah, the agency angle is something we haven't touched on, and that is particularly for less known actors and actresses in particular, they don't really
Right,
get to have a
right,
say, whereas
yes,
those that are, have made it in the industry do. It's another really important element, isn't it? Is that they don't have the freedom to be able to say no, especially when,
right,
yeah, they're starting out. So, Cap,
yes.
people want to read more about your stuff, and where's the best place for them to access it?
Well, like you said, I do have a Substack. That is where a lot of my personal work is published there. So if you were just to Google for Cap Stewart at Substack, or if you search for Unpop Culture, that's the name of my site there. I used to, until February of last year, I used to write at capstewart.com. That site is still up, so a lot of information is still there. And on capstewart.com, there is there's in the sidebar a link to pretty much all of my writings in all the different places, whether it's the Gospel Coalition or Reform Perspective or Christ and Pop Culture or wherever else. Like, there's just basically a link to all of those different sites where I've written. Those would be the two main ones, and then that way, people will get alerts for, hey, I've written a new article for the Gospel Coalition or whatnot. But I also post those articles on my Cap Stewart Facebook author page as well. I'm in my mid 40s, so I haven't done TikTok or some of the newer forms of social media, but Facebook and a little bit of Twitter. Facebook is mostly where I hang out socially anyway.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. Turn this parts of this interview into a reel, and maybe make it go viral on TikTok or something. Well, look, Cap, thanks so much for your time, and I really appreciate everything you're writing. I hope you found this latest interview helpful. As Cap said, you can find a lot of his material on Cap Stewart at Substack or capstewart.com. I'd really recommend it to you. He writes really clearly, really well, and I think really faithfully from the Bible and penetrating into our hearts. So I hope you've enjoyed this edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. Thanks, Cap, for joining us, and I look forward to seeing
Thank
you all
you.
next time.